night of a hot July day in Nashville, Tennessee, was drawing to a close. This area near the interstate off-ramp was usually just a place of simple, ordinary commerce, where drivers stopped for coffee and fuel before continuing their journeys. But on this particular morning, a gas station attendant noticed something strange near the pumps. A yellow semi-truck idling quietly, its engine rumbling, yet no driver was in sight. Inside the cab, slumped against the wheel, was a young woman. Her lifeless eyes were staring into nothingness, and it was immediately clear that she had been shot in the head. That single, brutal discovery would rip open a door to one of the darkest killing sprees in American highway history, a crime that seemed impossible to trace because it stretched across so many states. The investigation would lead authorities straight to Bruce Mendenhall, a man who looked more like someone's friendly neighbor than a cold-blooded killer. Mendenhall was a long-haul truck driver from Illinois who had spent most of his life on the road. He carried freight across the country, and as investigators soon discovered, he also carried bodies. Behind the wheel of his big rig, he found a chilling form of invisibility. He had no fixed address, no witnesses, and no obvious pattern, just endless highways stretching silently between his violent acts. He looked like the picture of a devoted husband and father, driving cross-country to provide for his family, but this was only half the truth. What looked like another tragic roadside murder soon unraveled into something much, much bigger. Inside the yellow semi-truck, detectives began finding blood stains, spent shell casings, and personal items belonging to multiple women. This was not one murder. It was a devastating trail of them scattered from state to state. When they arrested Bruce Mendenhall, he was unnervingly calm. He did not panic or resist, and he was soft-spoken and polite. When investigators asked whose blood they had found inside his cab, he simply shrugged, his face ordinary and gentle. They soon learned that Mendenhall had been targeting sex workers, runaways, and women he met at lonely truck stops. He would offer them a ride or a meal, lure them into his truck, and then end their lives with cold efficiency. The evidence in the interrogation room spoke louder than any words he might offer. There were blood samples from at least 5 different women inside his truck, and shell casings matched bullets recovered from crime scenes across several states, including Tennessee, Alabama, Indiana, and Illinois. He had collected women's purses, clothing, and even personal items, trophies, as if he carried pieces of their lives with him down every lonely stretch of asphalt. When detectives pressed harder, showing him photographs of the victims and their families, Bruce began to speak. His words came out low, deliberate, and chillingly casual. He described the smell of diesel mixing with blood, the sound of silence after the gunshot, and the long drives afterward, as if absolutely nothing had happened. He once told a fellow inmate there was something about being out at night. You can make someone disappear, and no one even knows they were ever alive. Investigators soon realized they were dealing with a man who had likely killed more than a dozen women, perhaps even 20 or more. Each murder took place near a truck stop along an interstate under the terrifying cover of night. Bruce Mendenhall was not just a killer. He was a predator, designed and hidden by the highways themselves, always moving and never staying long enough for suspicion to catch him. In the days that followed, Mendenhall's calm demeanor began to crack, and he started speaking in riddles, mentioning other victims, and even suggesting that he hadn't worked alone. By the time his confessions ended, police departments across half a dozen states had reopened their own cold cases. The image of the devoted husband and father was erased, leaving behind the horrifying reality of the cold-blooded killer who had turned America's highways into his personal graveyard. The trial in 2010 had no dramatic outbursts or emotional pleas. It was just the slow, methodical unveiling of a man who sat motionless, hands folded, expression blank as the prosecutor detailed the evidence. He didn't blink when the victims' names were read, as if empathy had been stripped from him long ago. When given a final chance to speak, his words were almost whisper soft. "I've been on the road too long. You forget who you are out there." In 2010, Bruce Mendenhall was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Even behind bars, investigators continued to link his name to unsolved homicides, stretching back decades, but he never showed remorse. He spoke about his crimes like the weather, something ordinary, something beyond control. Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight. If you are the kind of person who stays up late, listening to real stories like this, and you find something strangely compelling about mysteries that law enforcement still has not fully solved, I would really appreciate it if you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You can tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now, because there is something about late night that makes these stories feel different. Right? Now, before we go any further, lock your door and turn off the lights, because what comes next will show how a monster can hide right in plain sight. Outside the window, the rain has started. At first, it was only light drops on the glass, but then it turned steadier, heavier, the kind of rain that washes away footprints and makes back roads soft and quiet. It was the same kind of rain falling over that town the night they found her. And this is where the story begins. Mendenhall's story is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it rides right beside us, behind the wheel of a passing truck. He spent years running from guilt, but the road he loved eventually led him to a dead end, leaving only the cold silence of his victims behind. The silence of that prison cell is profound, but it is nothing compared to the silence he left across the interstate. This kind of predator, the one that hunts where no one is looking, leaves behind a unique kind of dread. And while Mendenhall found his final lockup in Tennessee, a very different kind of evil was about to surface in the humid quiet of a deep southern state. It was not a highway phantom they found next, but a local man who turned the peaceful, wooded areas of Charlotte County, Florida, into something so gruesome and ritualistic that it shocked the nation. On a warm April afternoon in 1996, in a densely wooded area of Charlotte County, Florida, police discovered a gruesome scene that would unravel into one of the state's most disturbing murder investigations. This wooded area was normally a secluded escape for nature lovers, but that day it became the shocking site of a ritualistic slaying. The body of Richard Allen Montgomery, just 21 years old, was found mutilated and tied to a tree. The young man had suffered unimaginable torture before his death, and the sheer brutality of the crime immediately raised alarms. This was no random act of violence, but the clear work of someone who took pleasure in inflicting pain and exerting total control. The investigation quickly led to the name Daniel Owen Conahan Jr., a local man with a dark and unstable past. Conahan had a childhood that seemed fairly ordinary on the surface. He later joined the military, but was discharged after accusations of homosexual advances toward fellow servicemen, which stained his record. After that, he pursued a career in nursing, yet his life remained perpetually shadowed by rumors and a growing sense of alienation. His false security came from being a seemingly ordinary local who still lived in the same town where he had grown up. What stood out most about Conahan was his dangerous obsession with binding, torture, and sadomasochism. He became known in local gay communities for his interest in erotic strangulation and bondage, often making offers to men to participate in what he called photo sessions. These were not simply harmless fantasies. Conahan had transformed his violent urges into a deadly reality. The discovery of Montgomery's body was not an isolated incident, and investigators soon realized they were dealing with a potential serial killer. The wooded areas around Charlotte County had become a dumping ground for what appeared to be a string of ritualistic murders. The victims, mostly young men, drifters, or sex workers, were bound, mutilated, and sometimes even dismembered. The cruelty suggested a killer driven, not by rage alone, but by a twisted form of sexual gratification and a craving for absolute dominance. Conahan's methods were chillingly calculated, and he reportedly lured men by offering them money to pose for bondage photographs. Once his victims were under his complete control, the fantasy turned into sadistic torture and ultimately murder. Reports suggest that as many as 7 to 9 victims may have fallen prey to Conahan, though only a few were formally tied to him in court. The breakthrough came when investigators were able to link Conahan directly to Richard Montgomery's murder. Physical evidence, including rope fibers, ligature marks consistent with his bondage methods, and witness testimony placing him with the victim, built a powerful case. In 1999, Conahan was brought to trial. Prosecutors emphasized how he preyed upon the vulnerable and marginalized, luring them with false promises only to subject them to sadistic torture. The evidence proved damning, and the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death for the killing of Richard Montgomery. Though only formally convicted of one murder, authorities strongly believe he was responsible for a string of others, and to this day, he remains a suspect in several unsolved cases involving mutilated male victims discovered in Florida during the 1990s. Conahan, known as the Hog Trail Killer for the remote Florida woods where his victims were found, stands as a haunting reminder of how predatory violence can thrive in the shadows of small communities. He sits on death row, his fate sealed by the horrors he inflicted, a man who transformed a twisted fantasy into a deadly, ritualized reality. The brutality he inflicted on the young man in the woods showed a level of control and theatrical cruelty that felt less like a crime and more like a scene directed by someone with a taste for performance. That very same chilling, almost cinematic quality would soon appear thousands of miles away on another coastline, where a killer would take control not just of his victims, but of a region's imagination. But somewhere else, far across the ocean, a fog was rolling in across the North Wales coast in the United Kingdom, and another meticulous killer was just beginning to write his darkest script. In the early hours of a cold September morning in 1995, along a lonely stretch of the North Wales coastline, the body of Henry Roberts was discovered near his isolated caravan. This area was normally a place for simple reflection and peace, but the gruesome scene revealed a terrifying darkness. Roberts had been stabbed repeatedly, and his body was left in a way that spoke not of rage, but of chilling control. To the police, it felt less like a random killing and more like a scene directed by someone with a taste for performance. The spree escalated quickly. Within weeks, another man, Edward McCarthy, was found buried in a remote forest, his throat cut with precision. Then came 2 more murders, Keith Randall's and Anthony Davies, killed in a similar, almost ritualistic fashion. 4 murders in just 3 months, and North Wales was paralyzed with fear. The press quickly dubbed him the Man in Black, a ghostly figure said to haunt the roads at night, attacking men without warning. There seemed to be no connection among the victims, different towns, different lives, yet the same brutal end. But behind that growing myth was a man hiding in absolute plain sight. Peter Moore, a 49-year-old cinema owner from Kinmel Bay. By day, Peter Moore ran small movie theaters, showing old films and chatting kindly with patrons. He projected an image of a friendly, ordinary local. But by night, he became something else entirely, a sadistic predator who hunted men for pleasure. Moore loved control, he loved uniforms, he loved weapons, and the feeling of power that came with inflicting fear. He lived alone, surrounded by memorabilia from horror films, and fantasized about being the kind of killer who terrified people just by existing. In 1995, he stopped fantasizing and began acting out his darkest script. When police finally stopped Peter Moore in December 1995, it was almost by accident. He was driving alone late at night, dressed in black, his calm expression unbroken. Inside his car, officers found a knife, gloves, and dark clothing, the same kind witnesses had described the killer wearing. At first, Moore denied everything, but when investigators searched his home, they uncovered a chilling double life. Behind the polished image of the friendly cinema owner lay a monstrous obsession with violence. His private collection included Nazi uniforms, police gear, military weapons, and hundreds of notes describing real and imagined attacks. In his basement, officers found hidden journals, pages of fantasies that read like movie scripts with detailed dialogue and stage directions. But among the fantasies were real names, the same men who were now dead. Under pressure, Moore began to speak, describing the murders with eerie detachment, recounting how he would approach his victims and strike. He claimed he killed for fun, that to him it was entertainment. He said he was inspired by fictional killers like Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers. Then came the most disturbing revelation. Moore claimed he hadn't acted alone, speaking of a mysterious partner, a master named Jason, who had ordered him to kill. Police quickly determined that Jason did not exist. He was a creation of Moore's twisted mind, a projection of the evil he refused to own. The truth was that there was only Peter Moore, the man who invented his own terrifying legend. He never once expressed remorse, instead smiling through most of the proceedings, as though enjoying the national attention. The jury found Moore guilty on all 4 counts of murder. His sentence was a whole life tariff, life imprisonment with no chance of release, ensuring he would die behind bars. Even in prison, Moore never apologized, carrying himself like a director reviewing his masterpiece, proud, self-satisfied, and unrepentant. He remains to this day one of Britain's most sadistic serial killers. He spent his life showing stories of horror on screen, and in the end, he became one. The chilling thing about Peter Moore is that he was a monster by choice. But sometimes, a monster is made by a system that fails to protect its own, and the violence is allowed to silently travel across vast distances until it is too late. Just a few years later, a completely different kind of predator was doing the same thing, but across the immense, silent geography of Russia. The story of Sergei Martynov, one of Russia's most brutal yet lesser-known serial killers, begins not with his birth, but with blood. In September 2010, in the Voronezh region, police discovered the body of a homeless woman who had been strangled with a belt. Her killer had lured her with alcohol, humiliated her, and finally murdered her in cold blood. What investigators did not yet realize was that they were standing on the trail of a drifter who had been murdering for decades, a man who carried death with him wherever he went. Martynov had been born in 1962, growing up with little stability, often homeless, and working small jobs as an electrician or handyman. People who met him described him as quiet, frail, even polite. Nothing in his appearance suggested the incredible cruelty he carried within. But by the early 1990s, The darkness inside him had already erupted. In 1992, Martinoff was convicted for one of his earliest and most horrifying crimes, the rape and murder of a minor. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but the Russian justice system failed dramatically. He served only 12 years before being released on parole. Freedom did not bring change. It only gave Martinoff new hunting grounds. The failures continued. In 2005, in the Kirov region, he attacked a 17-year-old girl, slashing her face with a razor blade. Although police caught Martinoff almost immediately, they made a shocking decision. Instead of keeping him behind bars, they released him under a simple written pledge not to leave town. That single decision gave him exactly what he wanted: the chance to vanish and become a ghost, traveling across Russia and killing as he went. Between 2005 and 2010, investigators discovered that Martinoff was responsible for a series of murders across 10 different regions of Russia, from Vladimir to Yekaterinburg. His victims were mostly vulnerable women living on the margins of society. Each time, he would gain their trust, spend time with them, and then turn violently when conflict or anger arose. In Ufa, he left behind more than just a body. Inside a victim's apartment, police found 2 disturbing letters. One was mockingly addressed to the cops, in which the killer boasted he was not afraid of them. The arrogance of the letters revealed a man who not only killed, but wanted to be noticed. What made Martinoff especially dangerous was his ability to blend in. He hitchhiked between towns, took small jobs, and presented himself as soft-spoken and skilled in repair work. Few could have imagined that behind this unassuming exterior was a man capable of such repeated and extreme violence, including an assault on a young girl while hired by her father for repair work. By 2010, his crimes had finally caught up with him. After a killing in Voronezh, investigators traced him to an unfinished hotel near a roadside cafe where he was working quietly as an electrician. Martinoff was arrested and taken into custody. During questioning, he showed no signs of insanity, and experts concluded that he was fully aware of his actions. His crimes were a result of calculated choices driven by cynicism and cruelty. Prosecutors noted that he had even desecrated many of the bodies after death. In November 2012, Sergei Martinoff was sentenced to life imprisonment for 8 murders, severe bodily harm, and the assault on the young girl. The case was a chilling reminder of how one man could drift across a nation, leaving behind only bodies and grief, yet remain invisible for so long. His story reminds Russia of a terrifying truth. Sometimes the quietest stranger, the man fixing wires in the corner, is the one carrying death in his hands. That pattern of invisibility, of hiding in plain sight by appearing ordinary, is what connects so many of these true crime stories. Now, we have to travel back across the globe to the highways of the American South, where another ghost was on the move, a man whose rage was built on a troubled childhood, and whose victims were found along the busiest interstate on the East Coast. The humid summer of 1994 brought fear to the sun-soaked highways of the American South. Men began turning up dead, strangled, beaten, and left behind in small motel rooms or quiet residential streets. The murders stretched from Florida to Georgia to Maryland, and each one was hauntingly similar. The killer left behind no fingerprints, no clear motive, and only one chilling pattern. Every victim was a middle-aged gay man. The press quickly dubbed him the I-95 killer. His name was Gary Ray Bowles, a man who appeared ordinary enough to be invisible, but behind his soft southern accent and calm demeanor lurked a profound darkness. Bowles drifted from town to town, living off charm and deception. He would meet men in bars or along the beach, pretending to be a down-on-his-luck laborer. They saw him as vulnerable, someone who needed help. But once they invited him in, once the door closed, kindness turned to horror. He would strangle them, often with whatever was at hand, a towel, a shirt, even the cord of a lamp. And when the horrific act was done, he took their money, their cars, and vanished into the next state, leaving behind nothing but fear and confusion. The FBI didn't know it yet, but they were chasing one of the most calculating killers to ever haunt America's highways. To understand Gary Ray Bowles, one has to go back to Quincy, Florida, in 1962. He was born into violence. His stepfather turned their home into a nightmare, repeatedly beating Bowles, forcing him to defend himself while his mother looked away. By the time he was 13, Bowles had run away for good. He survived by hustling on the streets, trading sex with older men for money, food, or shelter. Those years carved something cold into him, a hatred and confusion about his own identity, about trust, and especially about men who desired him. As he grew older, his crimes escalated from theft and robbery, and he was in and out of prison throughout the 1980s. In 1982, an early robbery attempt showed what he was truly capable of: sudden, uncontrollable violence. By 1993, Bowles was back on the streets again, homeless, angry, and consumed by resentment. He began targeting men who reminded him of those early, traumatic years. Men who were kind, trusting, and in his twisted perception, weak. In March of 1994, the killing began. His first known victim was John Hardy Roberts, a kind retired World War II veteran in Daytona Beach, Florida. Roberts offered Bowles a place to stay after meeting him at a local bar. Days later, Roberts was found strangled and bludgeoned. That car was later found hundreds of miles away, and the trail of bodies began to grow quickly. Within months, more victims followed, including David Allen Garr in Maryland, Milton Bradley in Georgia, and Walter Hinton in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Each crime bore the same signature: brutal strangulation and robbery. Bowles sometimes left taunting clues behind, almost daring police to catch him. The FBI launched a massive manhunt along Interstate 95, the highway that connected nearly all his crime scenes. In November 1994, his luck finally ran out. Police tracked him to Jacksonville Beach, where he was found reading a newspaper article about himself. He didn't resist arrest, simply looking up at the officers and saying, "You're looking for Gary Bowles. You found him." During interrogation, Bowles confessed to 6 murders, claiming he killed out of hatred for the men who, in his mind, symbolized his past abuse. Yet, in court, his calmness unnerved everyone. There was no remorse, no emotion, only a cold, steady quiet. In 1996, he was sentenced to death in Florida. For more than 2 decades, he sat on death row, occasionally blaming his childhood for his actions, but his words could never justify the horrors he had committed. On August 22, 2019, Gary Ray Bowles was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. His final statement was brief and hollow. "I'm sorry for what I did." As the poison flowed through his veins, the I-95 killer's story finally came to an end. The fear he left behind still lingers along the quiet roads of the American South. A profound reminder that Gary Ray Bowles was not a monster born in darkness. He was a man shaped by it. And sometimes, that is even more terrifying. His crimes were devastating, but he at least had a clear motive tied to his own history. Now we must turn our attention to a very different kind of killer. A man who, like Bowles, looked ordinary and was also in the military, but who preyed on the most innocent and vulnerable, the young boys in his own community. His story begins on a cold November morning in Nebraska, where a paper boy simply vanished. On a cold November morning in 1982, the quiet town of Bellevue, Nebraska, was shattered by a terrifying disappearance. A 13-year-old boy named Danny Joe Eberly was gone, vanishing while delivering newspapers, an ordinary chore in a safe neighborhood. His bicycle and his stack of papers were found abandoned nearby, a chilling reminder that something sinister had taken place. Days later, Danny's young life was brutally ended. His body was discovered bound with rope and stabbed multiple times. For residents of Bellevue, this was the kind of violence they only read about happening somewhere else, far away. The police scrambled for answers, sensing that this murder was methodical yet cruel, suggesting a killer who not only planned his crime, but perhaps relished the suffering it caused. Then, in September 1983, another tragedy struck. 12-year-old Christopher Walden went missing on his way to school. His body was later found in a wooded area, bearing the same disturbing hallmarks as Danny's murder. The community was thrown into panic as rumors spread about a predator lurking in the shadows, with 2 boys murdered in eerily similar ways and no suspect in sight. What no one knew was that these murders were part of a dark pattern tracing back to the troubled mind of a young man who was hiding in plain sight, John Joubert. Joubert appeared to many as just another young man trying to find his place in the world. He was stationed at Offutt Air Force Base, blending perfectly into military life. Outwardly, he was disciplined, polite, and completely unremarkable. But beneath his quiet exterior, a dangerous obsession festered, fed by a turbulent childhood marked by loneliness and bullying. He had harbored violent fantasies from an early age and developed an unsettling fascination with pain. Before moving to Nebraska, Joubert's darkness had already surfaced. A boy named Richard Stinson was found murdered in Maine in 1982, a case that bore striking similarities to the ones that would follow. In Nebraska, Joubert fed his compulsions by stalking neighborhoods and watching children, waiting for the opportunities to strike. When he encountered Danny Eberly and later Christopher Walden, it was not random. It was the culmination of years of inner torment. His choice of vulnerable victims was driven by a craving for power and domination. By 1983, police, the FBI, and military investigators began to narrow in. Tire impressions and rope fibers at the crime scenes hinted at a military connection. Joubert's calm demeanor belied his crimes, but small inconsistencies gave him away. Eventually, authorities searched his belongings and uncovered the horrifying truth. They found the same type of rope used to bind the victims, along with chilling journals detailing his violent fantasies. When confronted, Joubert confessed in chilling detail, explaining how he stalked his victims, how he tied them up, and the exact methods he used to end their lives. His confession revealed not only guilt, but a deeply disturbing lack of remorse. He admitted that he had struggled with these urges for years, but ultimately succumbed to them. Under questioning, he also linked himself to the killing of 11-year-old Richard Stinson in Maine, a case that had gone unsolved until that moment. Joubert was charged and convicted of the murders of Danny Eberly and Christopher Walden in 1984 and sentenced to death. His case drew national attention, not just for the brutality of the crimes, but for the psychological portrait it painted of a seemingly ordinary young man consumed by sadistic fantasies. He was executed by electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary on July 17, 1996, at the age of 33. John Joubert's story is a haunting reminder that evil can hide in plain sight behind the clean-cut appearance of a U.S. Air Force airman. He preyed on the most vulnerable, revealing a mind shaped by childhood trauma and an uncontrollable urge to dominate and destroy. It is a chilling thought that some of the most calculated predators use technology and desperation as their lure. Joubert used the quiet of a safe neighborhood as his cover, but somewhere else, a man was using the vast, anonymous reach of the internet to find his victims, turning the simple act of looking for a job into a death sentence. In the early 2010s, the United States was facing a difficult economic period, and many vulnerable men were desperate for any opportunity to earn a living. It was in this atmosphere of hope and uncertainty that a predator saw a perfect hunting ground. This killer would operate in broad daylight, hiding behind a mask of trustworthiness and false generosity. His weapon was not just violence, but a calculated deception. The man was Richard Beasley, a man with a long history of charges ranging from theft to drug offenses. By 2011, he had evolved into something far darker, a predator who saw desperation as an opportunity. Alongside his teenage accomplice, Brogan Rafferty, he created online advertisements on Craigslist. These ads were devastatingly effective because they promised jobs on a sprawling farm in Ohio, offering steady pay, food, and shelter to men willing to work hard. Struggling men, often isolated or down on their luck, answered these ads with hope in their hearts, believing they were taking a step towards stability. Instead, they were walking straight into Beasley's carefully constructed snare. One by one, victims arrived expecting employment. Instead, they were led to remote wooded areas under the pretense of meeting the farm's owner or touring the land. There, far from prying eyes, Richard Beasley ambushed his victims with calculated cruelty, robbing them of their possessions before taking their lives. This was not random violence, it was the cold exploitation of the vulnerable. These men were not chosen because of who they were, but simply because they were easy prey in a world that had already forgotten them. The first victims who disappeared had little in common beyond their need for work. Men in their 40s and 50s who were simply unemployed. They were being executed and buried in shallow graves across rural Ohio, discarded like broken tools once Beasley had taken what he wanted. As the bodies began to pile up, Beasley relied on his accomplice, Rafferty, to help lure in more victims. Beasley believed his cunning was enough to outsmart authorities, enough to keep his crimes buried. But greed and arrogance often undo even the most calculating predators, and the Craigslist ruse was bound to draw attention. By 2011, the bodies of several victims had been discovered, revealing the same brutal pattern: men lured with hope, ambushed, and executed. The realization was chilling. Someone was using the anonymity of the internet to transform a promise of work into a death sentence. The net finally began to close in on Richard Beasley after a man narrowly escaped his trap. This survivor provided authorities with critical details, tracing the Craigslist ads back to Beasley and Rafferty. When Beasley was arrested, the facade of a friendly job giver crumbled instantly. Instead, investigators saw a man whose life was marked by manipulation, control, and a chilling indifference to human life. The trial that followed revealed the full scope of his betrayal. 3 men dead and others targeted, all orchestrated with cold calculation. Beasley showed little remorse, standing defiant as the charges mounted against him. His accomplice, Brogan Rafferty, received a life sentence, but Richard Beasley received the ultimate penalty. Convicted of multiple murders, he was sentenced to death. His actions not only destroyed lives, but highlighted the disturbing reality that the internet could be weaponized by those with darkness in their hearts. Richard Beasley's story is one of cold-blooded exploitation. He saw vulnerability as opportunity and human lives as disposable. His betrayal of ordinary men simply searching for honest work makes his crimes all the more disturbing. Beasley awaits his fate on death row, but his story is a lasting cautionary tale about the dangers of misplaced faith in strangers and about how one man's hunger for power can transform hope into horror. But while Beasley used the internet to draw his victims into the dark, another killer in a major city would use the cover of a busy highway to claim his. Part 8. Rory Enrique Candy, the Tamiami Strangler. On the night of September 16, 1994, the body of a known cross-dressing sex worker was found abandoned by the roadside along the infamous Tamiami Trail. This busy road in Miami, Florida, was a major artery, yet the discovery was made on a lonely stretch where the victim, Lazaro Corrales, had been strangled. What shocked investigators was the calculated way his body had been left, discarded without care, yet in a manner that suggested the killer wanted him to be found. Miami police knew immediately this was not a random act of violence. It was deliberate, the work of someone who enjoyed control and who would almost certainly strike again. That someone was Rory Enrique Candy, later branded by the press as the Tamiami Strangler. Candy's choice of Lazaro was not accidental. In his confession years later, Rory admitted that he had picked him up, believing he was a woman. When he discovered otherwise, a violent rage took over. He lured Lazaro into his Kendall townhouse, strangled him, and then drove out to the lonely stretch of Highway 41 to dump his body. That night marked the beginning of a 5-month killing spree that would leave Miami gripped in fear. Just weeks later, on October 8, 1994, another body appeared. Elisa Martinez, a sex worker who had been strangled in exactly the same way. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Detectives began to suspect they were chasing a serial killer, though they didn't yet know his name. But the killer wanted them to know. On November 20th, 1994, the body of Charity Nava was discovered. Unlike the first two victims, her corpse carried something more disturbing than the brutality of strangulation. Words had been carved into her skin. Chilling phrases like "third" and "if you can catch me" marked the signature of a man who no longer feared being caught. He craved attention. For investigators, it was confirmation. They were hunting someone who was deliberately playing a game with them. Yet, despite the fear, Rory Candy kept hunting. Wanda Crawford was strangled 6 days later. By now, the police were convinced this was a pattern, but without witnesses and with the killer targeting victims from marginalized communities, progress was painfully slow. DNA had linked the crimes, but they still had no suspect. The man responsible was a 29-year-old father of two who lived in a modest condo near the very road he used as his dumping ground. Candy was not finished. Nicole Schneider was murdered in December, and on January 12, 1995, his sixth and final victim, Rhonda Dunn, met the same fate. All 6 lives were taken in less than 5 months, each strangulation carried out in his home before he transported the bodies to the trail. For nearly a year, Rory Candy evaded capture, blending into ordinary life. But his downfall came not from police work, but from a mistake. One last desperate attempt to control another woman. On June 19, 1995, police were called to a disturbance at Candy's home, where they found Gloria Maestra, bound and gagged, but still alive. She had managed to scream for help before he could kill her. When officers searched the home, they found personal items belonging to previous victims. Gloria herself identified Rory as her attacker, sealing his fate. Arrested days later, Rory Enrique Candy confessed in chilling detail to all 6 murders, claiming that rage, humiliation, and the pain of separation from his wife had driven him. Yet the cold precision of his crimes told another story. A man who enjoyed the power of taking life and who couldn't stop himself once he had started. He was sentenced to death in 1999, later receiving consecutive life sentences. Today, Rory Enrique Candy sits behind bars, his name forever tied to the Tamiami Trail and the 6 lives he stole. The sheer cruelty in his methods was almost theatrical, much like the killer of North Wales, but Candy's rage was impulsive, not ritualistic. Now, we turn to a completely different predator, a man who also used the quiet of the countryside as his cover, but whose crimes were rooted in a much older, darker kind of superstition in a small European country. The cold December morning of 1992 settled over the snow-covered outskirts of Bydgoszcz, northern Poland. This peaceful landscape suddenly revealed a scene of pure horror when a hunter stumbled upon something that would haunt the entire country. Hidden beneath pine branches was the half-frozen, mutilated body of a young woman. The brutality was horrifying, with deep wounds carved into her flesh. The body belonged to Justina, 23 years old, and the scene spoke not of a typical murder, but of a killer who had lingered, taken time, and perhaps satisfaction. This brutal discovery confirmed that Leszek Jacek Pękalski, a man who had spent more than a decade wandering across rural Poland, leaving a trail of tortured bodies in his wake, was still active. Pękalski was born in 1966 and grew up in extreme poverty, surrounded by violence, neglect, and ridicule. From childhood, he developed a festering obsession with death, blood, and control. Neighbors remembered him as a shy farmhand, a drifter described as strange but harmless. But behind that quiet exterior was a darkness that began with the killing and mutilation of animals for pleasure. It was only a matter of time before he turned his attention to humans. Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, Leszek Pękalski drifted through the Polish countryside like a ghost. He took odd jobs at farms and would vanish whenever suspicion arose. He was polite and sometimes even gentle at first glance, and women often trusted him easily, offering help with groceries or firewood. But when night fell, a different man emerged, one driven by violent fantasies. He carried a knife, rope, and sometimes a hammer, striking suddenly, binding his victims, and silencing them before carrying out his sadistic rituals. Some victims were mutilated after death, and others suffered prolonged torment. His crimes spanned small towns, surrounded by endless forests that swallowed screams before they could reach another soul. Police at the time were overwhelmed, and serial murder was still a concept few believed existed in the country. Pękalski's arrest was almost accidental. After the discovery of Justina's body in December 1992, witnesses mentioned a thin, unshaven farmhand who had been offering rides to women days earlier. When police visited his home, they found blood-stained clothes, ropes, and knives. During interrogation, Pękalski confessed not to one murder, but to 76. He described each killing with unnerving calm, recalling details that only the murderer could know. Investigators were horrified, but also skeptical, as many of his confessions couldn't be verified. Psychologists described him as a sexual sadist with psychopathic traits, yet of limited intelligence, an almost childlike killer acting out monstrous impulses. The media branded him the Vampire of Bydgoszcz after he revealed that he drank blood from some of his victims, claiming it made him feel powerful. In 1996, he was convicted of a single murder, Justina's, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The court acknowledged he likely committed many more, but lacked the physical evidence to convict. In 2017, After serving his full 25 years, Leszek Jacek Penkalski was released. Public outrage erupted, and he was placed under surveillance and later confined to a secure psychiatric facility for public safety. To this day, Penkalski remains one of Europe's most chilling enigmas. He once told a reporter, "I didn't want to kill, but when I saw their fear, I couldn't stop myself." The terror of the vampire of Bitu shows how cruelty and superstition can mix to create a horrific spree. But we must turn to another part of Russia, where another young man, driven by his own inner rage, was targeting the most ignored members of society with a disturbing new level of brutality. Between 2009 and 2010, in the industrial city of Rybinsk, Russia, a series of gruesome discoveries unsettled the community. Bodies of homeless men were turning up in abandoned lots and wooded areas, often mutilated beyond recognition. At first, these murders did not draw nationwide attention because the victims were marginalized men, often alcoholics or drifters. But the sheer brutality set the killings apart. The corpses were found with dozens of stab wounds and evidence of post-mortem mutilation. To investigators, it suggested not just violence, but a terrifying ritualistic obsession. Behind these murders was a young man few would have suspected, Alexander Bichkov. He was only in his mid-20s, outwardly unremarkable, blending into the gray backdrop of provincial Russia. Yet, within him seethed anger, humiliation, and a desire for control, fueled by years of emotional abuse from his parents. When his mother abandoned the family, Bichkov spiraled further, finding a twisted form of release in violence. The murders began with homeless men he would encounter near liquor stores or on the streets. Bichkov lured them with the promise of alcohol or food, leading them to secluded areas. Once alone, he unleashed frenzied attacks, stabbing his victims repeatedly. After killing them, he often dismembered the bodies, sometimes removing internal organs. In his diaries, later recovered by police, he wrote with disturbing casualness about eating parts of his victims. While the exact extent of this literal cannibalism remains debated, the sheer grotesque nature of his writings was undeniable. The transient nature of the victims and lack of witnesses meant the killings continued for years, giving Bichkov the freedom to indulge his darkest compulsions again and again. By 2011, whispers of a serial killer had begun to circulate in Rybinsk. Yet, Bichkov maintained a mask of normality, holding small jobs, mingling casually, and even having a girlfriend. Inside, however, he lived in a world dominated by rage and obsession. His diary read like a confession, a cold catalog of killings with numbers marking each murder, claiming responsibility for more than a dozen victims. The entries were not only detailed but disturbingly indifferent, treating human life as nothing more than prey. His downfall, like that of many killers, came not from a sudden breakthrough in the murder cases, but from a more mundane crime. In early 2012, Bichkov broke into a hardware store, stealing knives and supplies. He was arrested, and during routine questioning, officers noticed inconsistencies. Investigators soon connected him to suspicious disappearances and brought him in for further interrogation. Under pressure, Bichkov confessed, not reluctantly, but almost eagerly, describing his murders in matter-of-fact detail. The police, stunned by the scope of his claims, searched his home and discovered the incriminating diary that laid bare the extent of his crimes. Prosecutors argued that he had deliberately targeted the weakest members of society, homeless men whose deaths were unlikely to stir attention, ensuring his crimes could continue. The court ultimately found him criminally responsible, a man who chose again and again to kill. Bichkov himself showed little remorse, at times seeming detached, even bored, as prosecutors read the charges. In 2013, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Alexander Bichkov's case underscores a dark truth. Serial killers sometimes operate in forgotten corners, preying on society's most invisible members. His story is a chilling lesson in how indifference to the marginalized can give predators cover. His silence and his violence brought him to his final cage. But Bichkov was an active, obvious killer. The next predator we must examine was a ghost, a phantom who stalked the old and the frail in the heart of a major Russian city, vanishing for years until science finally brought him to justice. Between 2011 and 2012, the city of Kazan, deep in the heart of Russia's Republic of Tatarstan, was haunted by a terrifying phantom. Elderly women, all living alone, began dying in their homes, dozens of them. At first, the police thought it was coincidence, old age, or perhaps a robbery gone wrong. But then the chilling pattern emerged. Each woman was strangled with a makeshift ligature, something simple like a belt, a scarf, or a piece of fabric torn from their own clothes. The killer left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and absolutely no mercy. Locals began calling him the Granny Killer. Panic spread through Kazan's quiet neighborhoods, forcing elderly women to nail their doors shut from the inside. Over 2 years, the death toll rose to at least 26 women. The killer seemed unstoppable, moving silently from one apartment to another like a shadow slipping through the cracks of the city. For nearly a decade, the case went completely cold, leaving investigators baffled and the killer's name unknown. He remained a ghost story whispered in Kazan's alleys, until one winter day, almost 10 years later, the ghost returned to life. In 2020, advances in DNA analysis finally gave Russian investigators a critical breakthrough. They re-examined old evidence fibers, hair strands, and traces found under the victim's fingernails. After running the samples through Russia's expanding genetic database, a partial match appeared. The man had a criminal record for theft and burglary, and his name was Radik Tagirov. At first glance, he did not fit the image of a serial killer. Tagirov was a 38-year-old locksmith and roofer, living an ordinary, quiet life in Kazan. Neighbors described him as withdrawn, even gentle. But his criminal record hinted at something darker, a history of sneaking into homes and violating boundaries. Investigators began tailing him and noticed something chilling. Tagirov followed a daily routine, alone, meticulous, and emotionless. Then came the definitive DNA confirmation. Samples from at least 25 crime scenes matched Tagirov perfectly. The mysterious Granny Killer had finally been found. In December 2020, Tagirov was taken into custody without resistance. He didn't shout or ask questions. He simply looked down and said, "I understand." When questioned, he was disturbingly calm, his voice soft, as though he were discussing something mundane. He confessed to more than 20 murders. His targets were always elderly women living alone, usually aged between 75 and 90. He said he followed them home from grocery stores, pretending to help with their bags, waiting for the exact moment to strike. Once inside, he strangled them quickly and efficiently. When investigators asked him why, he said something that made everyone shiver. "I wanted to see the light leave their eyes. It made me feel calm." Forensic psychologists concluded that Tagirov exhibited psychopathic traits, being methodical, detached, and utterly devoid of empathy. He was outwardly normal, and that was his perfect camouflage. By 2022, he was officially charged with 32 murders. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. Radik Tagirov will likely spend the rest of his life in a Russian maximum security prison, a place as cold and silent as the life he led. He killed the most vulnerable, and for 10 long years, he walked among ordinary people, unseen and untouched. In the end, he was not just the killer of grandmothers, he was the killer of trust itself. This corruption of trust is a devastating thing. It also happened far away in another small community, where a man who smiled and helped his neighbors was secretly a brutal killer, using a simple, sharp weapon to unleash pure savagery. Part 12. Collins Jamisi Kutusia, the Kakamega Killer. The wind howled one night in 2019 over Kakamega, western Kenya, carrying screams that shattered the calm of a small village in Shinyalu. The scene that awaited police that morning was beyond imagination. A home drenched in blood, walls scarred with violence, and silence where laughter once lived. The attack was swift, merciless, and completely calculated. The man responsible was one of their own, Collins Jamisi Kutusha, a familiar face in the community. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and always smiling. No one could have imagined the monster hiding beneath that calm surface. The first bodies found were a mother and her 2 children, brutally hacked to death inside their home. Investigators initially believed it was a crime of rage, but as more bodies began to appear across the region, each bearing the same marks of savagery, one chilling truth emerged. This was the work of a cold predator. Whispers spread through Kakamega like wildfire that a killer walked among them, striking without warning and vanishing before dawn. Before he became a murderer, Collins Kutusia was already a broken man. He grew up in poverty and violence, and by his teenage years, he was showing signs of instability, with violent outbursts and a fascination with death. He drifted between odd jobs, sometimes working as a motorcycle taxi rider. But beneath the surface, his hatred was growing, directed at everyone he believed had wronged him, including neighbors and relatives. His first killing may have happened years earlier, in 2015, but no charges were ever filed, a failure that allowed him to keep killing silently and strategically. He developed a chilling pattern. He would stalk his victims quietly, wait until nightfall, and attack them with a machete or a blunt object, often leaving the bodies in their homes or nearby sugarcane fields. Detectives described his methods as coldly efficient. He didn't steal, he simply killed and walked away. What made him especially terrifying was his duality. During the day, he smiled and chatted with locals, pretending to be one of them. At night, he became something else entirely. A butcher, a man at war with the world around him. By late 2019, panic had gripped the villages, with families sleeping in groups, yet still, the killings continued. The end of his spree came because of a single mistake. In early 2020, Kutusha attempted to attack another family, but this time, one of the victims survived. Badly wounded, she crawled out of the house and whispered the name everyone now feared, Collins. Police launched a manhunt, and he was eventually captured, hiding in a relative's home, with blood still on his clothes. When officers interrogated him, he showed absolutely no emotion. He admitted to multiple killings, describing each one with chilling calmness. He told them he didn't feel anger, only satisfaction, and spoke of voices that told him what to do. Psychiatrists later described him as deeply disturbed, but fully aware of his actions. In 2021, Collins Jamisi Kutusia was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. The families of the victims wept, but he stood expressionless as the verdict was read, offering no apology and no remorse. His crimes remain some of the most horrifying in Kenya's modern history. He was not a monster from stories. He was a man who walked their streets, shared their laughter, and turned their trust into terror. The terror he brought was intensely personal and close to home. Now, we must turn to a sophisticated predator in a large western city, a man who also used a pattern of escalating, ritualistic violence against women, hiding behind an incredibly bland, ordinary face. On an October morning in 1997 in Melbourne, Australia, the calm that often hides what the night left behind was shattered. Joggers passing a deserted area near Somerton noticed something strange among the brush. A woman's body, partially covered, brutally stabbed, and left like a secret no one was meant to find. Her name was Margaret Marr, a 40-year-old sex worker who had vanished the night before. The brutality was chilling, with multiple stab wounds and her body posed, her dignity stripped away. To detectives, the violence spoke of rage, but not blind rage. This was methodical, practiced, and ritualistic. Whoever did this had done it before or planned to again. For months, investigators searched without answers. But somewhere in the city, a man walked free, calm, polite, and completely invisible in plain sight. That man was Peter Norris Dupas, a predator who wore the mask of normality better than anyone. To his neighbors, he was quiet, almost shy. But beneath that facade was a darkness that had followed him since his teens. Dupas had been in and out of prison for decades, always for attacks on women. Each time he swore to reform, and each time the system believed him, allowing him to be released. What no one yet realized was that Margaret Marr's death was only the beginning of a new spree. Just 3 months after Marr's body was found, another murder shocked Melbourne. On December 31st, 1997, Kathleen Downs, a 95-year-old widow living alone in Brunswick, was discovered inside her home. The scene was grotesque. She had been stabbed multiple times, her face mutilated in the same precise, deliberate manner as Margaret Marr's. To police, the pattern was unmistakable, and the killer was escalating. The wounds were not random, they were symmetrical and controlled. The mutilation wasn't about anger, it was about domination. What investigators didn't know was that Dupas had been living just streets away. For him, murder was never spontaneous. It was planned like a performance, where every cut and every breath was part of the ritual. After the Downs murder, the city descended into fear, and police chillingly realized that Dupas had been released from prison only months before the killings began. In April 1999, Nicole Patterson, a 28-year-old psychology graduate, welcomed Dupas into her home office. He claimed he needed therapy for anger and impulse control, but minutes later, she was dead, stabbed and mutilated in the same horrifying pattern. A witness saw a man leaving her apartment that matched Dupas's description. When detectives searched his home, they found Patterson's blood on his clothes and traces of her DNA in his car. The monster behind Melbourne's silent killings had finally been caught. The courtroom fell silent as Peter Norris Dupas entered, showing no remorse, no emotion. In 2000, he was convicted of Patterson's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Further forensic analysis tied him to Kathleen Downs and Margaret Marr, leading to 2 additional life sentences without parole in 2004. Psychologists labeled him a cold, calculating psychopath, a man driven not by rage, but by control. He claimed that seeing women made him feel powerless, and killing them made him feel whole again. Peter Norris Dupas became a symbol of the evil that hides in plain sight. His story is one of cold precision, proving that the most terrifying killers are the ones who never lose control. That chilling failure to stop him earlier is a theme that repeats itself, and it leads us directly to a more recent tragedy in the United States, where a major system failure allowed a known violent offender to walk free and find his victims along a quiet river. Part 14. Jesse Lee Calhoun, the Portland River Killer. Between February and May of 2023, the Willamette and Clackamas rivers in Portland, Oregon, became silent witnesses to something far darker than the water itself. 5 young women were found dead, sometimes floating downstream, sometimes left in overgrown woods at the city's edge. At first, each case appeared separate, a tragic accident, but Portland residents didn't believe that. The victims were all young and vulnerable: Kristen Smith, Brandy Calderon, Charity Perry, Bridget Webster, and Ashley Reel. For months, investigators searched for a connection. Then, a chilling pattern emerged. Every single woman had at some point crossed paths with one man, Jesse Lee Calhoun. Calhoun was no stranger to law enforcement, with a long history of theft, assault, drug crimes, and domestic violence. He was dangerous, manipulative, and charismatic in the worst possible way. But what made his story truly disturbing was not just the murders, but how he had been set free to commit them. Calhoun was in and out of jail for nearly 2 decades, and in 2019, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison for assaulting a police officer. It should have kept him off the streets for a long time. But then came COVID-19 and a political decision that changed everything. In 2021, Oregon's governor, Kate Brown, granted commutations to over 1,000 inmates who had helped fight wildfires during the pandemic. Jesse Lee Calhoun was one of them. He was released early, hailed as a man who had earned a second chance. The system had set him free, but freedom only gave him room to become the monster he truly was. Once out, Calhoun slipped into Portland's underworld, a dangerous world of addiction and homelessness. He preyed on vulnerable women, offering rides, a place to stay, or small favors, the perfect setup to lure them in. He was a predator who knew exactly how to find victims society had already forgotten. As the bodies began to appear, police hesitated to link the cases, fearing public panic. But the same name kept surfacing through DNA evidence and timelines, the same phone records, the same truck, the same man. The truth began to surface in July 2023, when police quietly arrested Calhoun for violating his parole. Through forensic data, cell phone tracking, and witness statements, investigators linked Calhoun to multiple victims. His phone had pinged near the same remote areas where several bodies were found. Items belonging to victims were discovered in his vehicle, and most damning of all, his DNA was a match. In January 2024, he was officially named the prime suspect in the killings of at least 4 women. Calhoun's demeanor in custody was chilling, calm, arrogant, even amused. He reportedly said, "People disappear all the time. You can't pin everything on me." Outrage exploded across Oregon as the details of his early release came to light, with families calling it a catastrophic failure of justice. The haunting question remains, how could one man be given a second chance only to take 5 lives? The Willamette River keeps flowing, but it carries with it the weight of those who were lost, a silent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we set free ourselves. The failure of the justice system to keep a killer locked up is one thing, but what happens when the failure is within the walls of a place meant to heal? Our next predator was trusted to save lives, but instead, He carried the ultimate power of life and death in his hands every single night. It began quietly, too quietly, at the Vermilion County Hospital in Clinton, Indiana. Death had started to arrive on schedule. Patients who were stable one moment would suddenly crash the next. It was the early 1990s, and something sinister was moving through the hospitals, unseen and unstoppable. Nurses whispered among themselves that someone was killing patients, and the deaths were strangely consistent, all happening during one man's shift. That man was Orville Lynn Majors, a 30-year-old licensed practical nurse. He was charismatic, confident, and adored by many of his colleagues. Families trusted him, and doctors respected him. Patients even called him an angel, but the angel had a darker side. Underneath the polished uniform and friendly demeanor was a man who despised the weak. He reportedly told colleagues that old people should be gassed, mocking dying patients and claiming they were draining the system. And whenever he was on duty, someone always seemed to die. By 1995, the numbers were impossible to ignore. The hospital's mortality rate had tripled, and nearly every unexplained death occurred when Majors was in the room. Born and raised on a modest Indiana farm, Majors had intelligence and ambition, but also a profound lack of compassion. He enjoyed control, the feeling of power that came from holding life and death in his hands. The turning point came in 1993, when nurses began to notice a chilling pattern. Whenever Majors entered a patient's room, alarms would soon sound. He was always the first to respond, and often the one to pronounce the time of death. Patients who were alert and talking minutes earlier were suddenly lifeless. A few brave nurses reported their suspicions, but their warnings were dismissed. Majors was popular, and management feared a scandal more than they feared the truth. Then the whispers turned into statistics. Statisticians reviewing hospital records found that the death rate had skyrocketed sixfold during Majors' shifts. Autopsies later revealed traces of potassium chloride and epinephrine substances that, when injected in high doses, can stop a heart in seconds. It was cold, clinical, and precise, a method that matched Majors' personality perfectly. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the subtle fear among his coworkers, and the way they looked at him, half in awe, half in dread. He had become addicted to killing. The investigation expanded into one of the largest criminal cases in Indiana's history. Police exhumed 15 bodies, and toxicologists confirmed sudden cardiac arrest caused by chemical overdose. Orville Lynn Majors was arrested in December 1997, charged with 6 counts of murder. During his 1999 trial, prosecutors revealed chilling testimony. Coworkers remembered Major standing by as patients flatlined, coldly watching as their monitors beeped their final notes. One nurse said he'd once smirked during a code and said, "You can't save them all." Majors was found guilty of 6 murders and sentenced to 360 years in prison. Investigators, however, believe the true number of his victims was far higher, possibly over 100. He died behind bars in 2017, never confessing, never apologizing. Orville Lynn Majors was not a shadowy figure lurking in the dark. He was a nurse, a caregiver, a man trusted with saving lives. He killed for power, for the thrill of playing God. He taught the world that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear scrubs. The system failed the patients of Clinton, Indiana, just as profoundly as it failed a vulnerable group of young women in a small, rural part of France decades earlier. Our next killer was also a man trusted to transport and care for the vulnerable, and his crimes went completely unchecked for decades. In the late 1970s, the region of Yonne in Burgundy, France, was a quiet and rural area, seemingly far removed from chaos. Yet, beneath this tranquility, an unsettling pattern began to unfold. Between 1975 and 1979, 7 young women, all residents of a local institute for people with learning difficulties, suddenly disappeared without a trace. These missing girls were profoundly vulnerable, relying heavily on others for support and guidance. Their families, often of modest means, pleaded desperately for answers as the disappearances mounted. Time and again, however, the cases seemed to stall, the investigations failing to progress. The young women appeared to simply vanish into the countryside, swallowed by silence. Suspicion quietly lingered around one man, Émile Louis, a bus driver employed to transport some of the girls from the institute. He was a quiet figure, an ordinary man in appearance, but whispers circulated about his temper and troubled behavior. Still, police found no direct evidence tying him to the vanishings. For years, the girls were tragically considered runaways, their cases left to gather dust in police archives. Their families were left without answers, their grief dismissed with cold, institutional efficiency. Decades passed before the truth began to surface. By the 1990s, Émile Louis was no longer just an ordinary man in the shadows. He had already been convicted of assaulting young girls and was known to law enforcement as a predator. Yet, it was not until 1997 that his name resurfaced in connection with the Yonne disappearances. A retired police officer, still haunted by the unsolved cases, began persistently pushing for a re-examination of the old files. The officer's persistence forced open the old files and revealed the devastating lack of follow-up in the original investigations. As scrutiny intensified, Émile Louis himself, under questioning, began to talk. To the absolute shock of authorities, he confessed. Louis admitted to abducting and murdering several of the missing women, detailing how he had lured them and taken advantage of their innocence. But his words were as cold as they were incomplete, as he refused to provide clear details about where the bodies were hidden, leaving families in despair. The system's failure was devastatingly clear. Louis had been allowed to live freely for decades after the crimes, and the French judicial system had ignored or mishandled crucial evidence that could have stopped him much earlier. In 2004, Émile Louis stood trial for the murders of 7 young women. The court revealed the scope of his crimes and painted a portrait of a manipulative, violent predator who had used his position and the vulnerability of his victims to commit acts of shocking cruelty. Louis remained chillingly indifferent, showing no empathy for the pain he had caused. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Louis died in prison in 2013, never offering full clarity about his crimes and leaving unanswered questions and unmarked graves behind. His story is a chilling reminder that killers like Émile Louis thrive not just because of their cruelty, but because indifference and neglect give them the space to act. His methodical cruelty was unchecked for years. We now turn to a killer on the other side of the world who was equally meticulous, using a specific, precise signature on his victims and hiding behind the anonymity of a major transportation corridor. Part 17. Roger Reese Kibbe, the I-5 Strangler. It began with a quiet discovery in September 1987 near Lake Berryessa, California, a finding that would haunt investigators forever. The body of a young woman was found partially clothed, bound with cut pieces of parachute cord. Her name was Darcy Frackenpole, a 17-year-old runaway who had been strangled. But there was something even more disturbing. Around her wrists and ankles, the killer had cut the bindings cleanly, with surgical precision. The knots, the cuts, and the way the body was posed all suggested absolute control, almost craftsmanship. Police knew they were looking at someone who planned everything, someone who saw killing not as chaos, but as art. They called him the I-5 Strangler, a predator who prowled along Interstate 5, hunting women who were alone or desperate. For years, he blended into the background of California's highways, just another man behind the wheel of a van. The collector of control. That man was Roger Reese Kibbe, a seemingly ordinary shop owner from Sacramento who ran a small furniture repair business. He was known to his neighbors as quiet, polite, and even helpful. But when the sun went down, Kibbe became a patient, calculating hunter, driven by dark fantasies. His dark path began in his early life, fascinated by ropes and knots. By high school, this interest had turned darker, leading him to steal women's clothes and cut them into strips, keeping pieces like trophies. He would drive alone for hours, scanning the roadside for vulnerable women. Once they were in his car, there was no escape. Kibbe's method was chillingly consistent. He would bind their hands, assault them, and strangle them. Then, he'd cut pieces of their clothing into perfect squares, souvenirs, precise and deliberate, as though he were documenting his crimes. He was leaving behind a silent message. I was here. I am in control. By the late 1980s, a task force had linked several murders through DNA and fiber analysis. Still, Kibbe's identity remained hidden. He smiled, cooperated, and convinced detectives he was innocent. But his arrogance became his downfall. In 1987, when police caught him attempting to abduct another woman, the evidence finally began to close in. A search of his home revealed pieces of rope, women's clothing, and scraps of fabric matching the crime scenes. The quiet shop owner was unmasked as one of California's most methodical killers. Even after his arrest, Kibbe refused to admit to most of his crimes, silent, composed, almost proud. In 1991, he was convicted for Darcy Frackenpole's murder. It took almost 2 decades for the full truth to emerge, when advances in DNA technology in 2009 linked him to at least 7 other victims along Interstate 5. He finally broke his silence, describing each killing in eerie, emotionless detail, speaking of his crimes as if recounting memories, not murders. In February 2021, Roger Reese Kibbe's story ended as violently as it began. Guards found him dead in his cell at Mule Creek State Prison, strangled by another inmate, a grim, final twist of irony for the man who had taken so many lives by the same method. Kibbe didn't just take lives, he studied them, perfected the act, and proved that the most terrifying monsters are the ones who never lose control. That chilling composure and intellectual detachment, the idea of a killer who studies his craft, is perhaps the most unsettling type of predator. Now, we must turn to a more recent case, where a man with an intellectual obsession with crime used his knowledge to commit a shocking, high-profile atrocity in a quiet college town. It was a cold November night in 2022, when a terrible silence fell over a small off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho. This quiet college town was shattered by a brutal attack that left 4 University of Idaho students murdered in their sleep. There were no signs of forced entry, no cries for help, only the faint trace of a predator who had moved like a shadow through their rooms. 4 promising lives were gone in an instant, their futures erased by a faceless killer who had slipped into the night unseen. The nation demanded answers. For weeks, rumors swirled, but as detectives meticulously pieced together every footprint, fingerprint, and camera feed, a single thread began to emerge. A white Hyundai Elantra seen near the house around the time of the murders. That car became the key that led them miles away, across state lines in Washington to a man named Brian Christopher Kohberger. Kohberger was a quiet, intelligent PhD student in criminology at Washington State University. He was fascinated by crime, even obsessed with it, studying criminal behavior, profiling, and forensic evidence. He was always asking how killers think, how they plan, and how they evade capture. Now, it seemed someone had used that very knowledge for something far darker. Investigators began tracing every step of Kohberger's life leading up to that November night. He was 28 years old, by all appearances, a disciplined, meticulous academic. Yet beneath that intellectual surface was a man consumed by control, the mechanics of violence, and the psychology of power. On online forums, he had posted under pseudonyms, asking former criminals about their emotions during attacks and how they chose their victims. The deeper detectives dug, the more his curiosity began to look exactly like preparation. When police searched Kohberger's apartment, they found latex gloves and traces of DNA. The decisive clue was a knife sheath found beside one of the victims, which carried a single male DNA profile. This was later confirmed to match Kohberger through genetic genealogy. Cell tower records placed him near the victim's house multiple times in the weeks before the murders, like a predator watching, studying, and waiting. When police finally moved in on December 30th, 2022, they found him at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. The arrest was quiet, clinical, almost anticlimactic. The man who studied crime had become its subject, caught by the very methods he thought he understood better than anyone. Kohberger showed no visible remorse, only silence. He was intelligent, educated, and eerily composed. He spoke about wanting to understand what made people kill, fascinated by dominance. The prosecution built its case piece by piece: DNA, digital evidence, and the chilling timeline. This was not a crime of impulse, it was a crime of obsession. He was a calculated, cold act by a man who believed he could outthink everyone. Brian Kohberger once studied how murderers think and how they hide, but no textbook could save him from the reality of what he'd done. He entered the world of killers to understand their minds and became one himself. The coldness of a calculated killer is terrifying, but so is the random violence of a killer driven by deep-seated hatred and conspiracy. Our next predator acted on a specific, hateful delusion, and his victims were found far from any campus, along the freeways of a major metropolis. It was a quiet November night in Los Angeles, 2023. Traffic along Interstate 210 moved slowly, but somewhere in that sea of headlights, a silver Tesla slowed to a stop, not because of traffic, but because death was waiting. Behind the wheel sat Nicholas Cimbolin, a 42-year-old father and tech executive. He was followed into his garage, and seconds later, neighbors heard a single, sharp gunshot echo through the night. The killer didn't run. He simply walked away, calm and silent, as if nothing had happened. When police arrived, Cimbolin's Tesla was still idling, his lifeless body lying beside it. There was no robbery, no struggle, and no reason, just a clean, deliberate execution. At first, detectives thought it was random, but within days, 2 more men were found dead in eerily similar fashion. The victims had nothing in common, except one chilling thing. They were all Asian men. Los Angeles was suddenly on edge, and police began to realize they were hunting a predator. Detectives pored over surveillance footage and phone records, and then they got a crucial break. A black BMW was caught on video leaving the scene of Cimbolin's murder. License plate readers traced it back to a man named Jared Joseph Powell, 33 years old. Powell had no major criminal record, nothing to hint at the monster he was about to become. But beneath the surface, there was intense rage. Friends later described him as paranoid, withdrawn, and obsessed with conspiracy theories. He believed he was being targeted and that the world owed him something. Powell's rampage escalated as he allegedly stalked his victims across multiple cities, shooting men at random. Each attack was swift, precise, and cold, bearing the same signature. Victims approached in their cars or near their homes, a single gunshot, and the killer disappearing into the night. The moment that changed everything came when a California Highway Patrol officer stopped his suspicious BMW, finding the murder weapon in his possession. Within hours, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department announced they believed they had caught a serial killer. Confronted with the evidence, Powell showed no emotion, no panic, no confusion, just silence. Investigators found disturbing notes in his apartment suggesting he had been planning more attacks. A portrait of a deeply fractured man emerged, intelligent but isolated, angry but calculating. In his mind, the killings were justice. Prosecutors charged Powell with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, alleging hate crime enhancements for targeting Asian men. Powell never apologized and never explained. He simply sat expressionless as his victims' families spoke his name through sobs. He was not a mastermind. He was something far more terrifying, a man who believed his madness made sense. Jarrett Joseph Powell sits behind bars awaiting trial, a reminder that evil can look ordinary, drive an ordinary car, and pass you by without a sound. Monsters like Powell don't come from the shadows, they drive right beside us. His need for total control was driven by delusion and rage. We must now examine a different kind of predator, one who also controlled his victims with chilling precision, but who used psychological terror to turn his victims against one another, creating a hidden hell on earth. It began inside an unremarkable apartment in Kitakyushu, Japan, a quiet neighborhood that hid unimaginable horrors behind closed doors. In March 1996, neighbors noticed strange smells coming from the residence of Futoshi Matsunaga and his partner Junko Ogata. They assumed it was burning garbage. But what they didn't know was that the garbage was human remains, the ashes of a victim Matsunaga had ordered Ogata to help dispose of after days of unrelenting torture. The victim was not a stranger. She was Junko's own relative, a woman who had come seeking help and never left alive. Under Matsunaga's command, Ogata watched as the person she loved most was beaten, electrocuted, and broken, all in the name of purification. The killing marked the beginning of one of Japan's most sadistic crime sprees, a nightmare born from manipulation and absolute control. To the world outside, Futoshi Matsunaga appeared successful, a confident, intelligent man who ran a small electrical business. But his charisma masked a monstrous ego. His power wasn't in physical strength. It was in his ability to twist minds and bend wills until people obeyed him without question. Matsunaga grew up with a sense of superiority, mastering deceit early in life. He became articulate and persuasive, knowing exactly how to make people trust him. But behind that mask, he was experimenting with psychological domination, seducing women, isolating them from their families, and slowly destroying their confidence. He met Junko Ogata, an impressionable young woman, and quickly began her psychological enslavement. Matsunaga began luring others into their circle, friends, acquaintances, and eventually Junko's own family members. Once under his control, they were subjected to terrifying rituals of obedience. He used electrical shocks, starvation, and psychological degradation to cleanse them. He forced victims to write confessions for imaginary sins and used wires from his business to electrocute those who disobeyed. He convinced them he could read their minds, punishing them immediately if they dared to think of escape. Matsunaga gained complete control over a group of several people, restricting their food, their movement, and even their thoughts. He forced victims, including Junko's parents, sister, and nephew, to turn against one another. In one chilling instance, he forced Ogata to torture her own mother while he watched, smiling. After she died, he ordered her body burned to eliminate evidence, forcing survivors to take part in the disposal, ensuring their guilt kept them silent. The apartment turned into a prison of fear. Unlike typical serial killers, Matsunaga treated his victims like puppets in a long, sadistic play. It wasn't until 2002, after nearly a decade of death, that one young woman managed to escape and told police everything. When police entered Matsunaga's properties, they discovered burn marks, electrical cords, and human remains hidden in ashes, confirming the horrific account. Matsunaga was arrested, and even in custody, he tried to manipulate officers, smiling as if he were untouchable. The investigation uncovered 6 confirmed victims. During the trial, prosecutors called Futoshi Matsunaga a demon in human skin. In 2005, he was sentenced to death by hanging. Matsunaga never admitted guilt, insisting that the victims had died of their own will, claiming they were weak-minded. His cold detachment stunned the courtroom. The Kitakyushu murders remain one of Japan's darkest and most disturbing crimes. Matsunaga's weapon was the human mind itself. He proved that evil sometimes begins with a smile and the quiet promise of safety that turns into hell. His terrifying brand of total control leads us to our next predator, a man who also sought complete dominance in every one of his crimes, but whose invisible nature was so effective that his identity remained a mystery for 2 decades after his death. It was a quiet evening in 1990 in the small town of Portageville, Missouri. Inside a modest home, a mother tucked her 2 young daughters into bed, completely unaware that death was already watching from the darkness outside. Moments later, the window shattered, and a man forced his way in, acting calmly and methodically. Within minutes, the house became a nightmare. The mother was found strangled and shot, and her daughters were brutally assaulted, one of them barely surviving. The killer had vanished without a trace, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no name, just a ghost who left behind fear and silence. For years, detectives hunted him, comparing evidence and building endless suspect lists, but nothing fit. The DNA profile they recovered belonged to no one in any database. It was as if the killer didn't exist. And yet, he did. His name was Robert Eugene Brashers, a man who moved through life with disarming charm and terrifying precision. Born in 1958, Brashers was a man of contradictions, intelligent, charismatic, a veteran who held steady jobs, and a devoted father. But beneath that surface, he carried a darkness no one could see, a predator hiding in plain sight. He was incredibly careful and calculated, studying his victims and learning their routines, striking when they least expected it. Each crime showed a chilling pattern of deliberate domination and control. For over a decade, Robert Brashers was a ghost haunting the American heartland. In the late 1990s, a chilling pattern of sexual assaults and murders began to resurface across Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee. The crimes shared the same method and the same calculated cruelty, and the DNA matched in every case. Detectives called him the Interstate Ghost. Behind this phantom, Brashers was living an entirely different life. He worked as a machinist, went to church, and was known for his polite manners. But his charm was a mask. Investigators would later discover he spent his nights studying police radio frequencies, learning forensic techniques, and keeping detailed notes about how to avoid detection. He was methodical, a chilling student of evil. In April 1998, everything began to unravel. Police stopped Brashers in Kennett, Missouri, in a stolen vehicle, leading to a violent confrontation. Brashers escaped but was wounded, and that same night, he broke into a random home, holding a woman hostage. When police finally surrounded the house, Brashers refused to surrender. The standoff ended with a single gunshot. Robert Eugene Brashers had turned the weapon on himself. The killer had died, but the mystery was far from over. His body lay in the morgue, his DNA still unconnected to any crime scene. They buried him without realizing that one of the most elusive serial predators in America had just died by his own hand. It would take decades for science to finally catch up with the ghost. In 2018, a cold case unit revisited the string of unsolved murders and used a modern genealogy lab on the old DNA samples. Within weeks, the results came back, pointing to a man long dead, Robert Eugene Brashers. The revelation was stunning. The polite, soft-spoken man who died in a police standoff was the monster they had hunted across 3 states. He was conclusively linked to the 1990 murder of Geneva, Jenny Casey in Missouri, the 1997 double homicide of Sherry and Megan Scherer in Portageville, and several sexual assaults in Arkansas. The most haunting fact was how close he had lived to them, a family man, a neighbor, a worker, hiding his true nature behind a face that inspired trust. He died before justice could reach him, leaving behind questions that will never be answered. Robert Eugene Brashers, the ghost of the interstate, lived 2 lives, and in both he was deadly. But somewhere else, a predator was using the power of belief to justify a much larger, more grotesque kind of slaughter. It was a humid night in 1997 on the outskirts of Medan, North Sumatra. A group of villagers, following a trail of disturbed earth through the sugarcane fields, stumbled upon something horrifying: the decomposing body of a young woman, half buried in a shallow grave. Her limbs were bound, and around her neck was a length of electrical cable. What horrified police most was the discovery that the grave was not alone. Dozens more shallow mounds stretched into the darkness. This was the moment Indonesia met Ahmad Suraji, the man who would later confess to killing 42 women in a series of black magic rituals unlike anything seen before. Suraji was not a shadowy figure in an alleyway. He was a respected dukun, a traditional healer and spiritual advisor. People came to him for help with love, success, and fortune, trusting him as a conduit to the unseen. But behind that calm, wise facade lay a dark obsession. In 1986, he claimed to have received a terrifying vision. The ghost of his father told him that to gain ultimate power, he needed to drink the saliva of 70 dead women. To Suraji, this was not a warning, it was a sacred command. The ritual he devised was simple and horrifying. Women, usually between 17 and 40, came to him seeking blessings. He led them into the sugarcane fields, instructed them to kneel, and wrapped their necks with fabric to channel spiritual energy. Then, without hesitation, he tightened the cloth until they stopped breathing. He would bury the body upright, head above the soil, then drink the saliva that leaked from their mouths, believing it would transfer their spiritual essence to him. For over a decade, this pattern continued undetected. Suraji's charm and spiritual authority shielded him from suspicion. He even performed blessings for the local police officers, who would later uncover his crimes. As the killings continued, his methods became sloppier, and rumors started to spread. The turning point came in 1997 when the body of Sri Kamaladui was found half buried near Suraji's land. When police questioned him, he was arrogant, even offering to help them spiritually locate the killer. But officers noticed fresh earth behind his house, and when they began digging, they uncovered multiple graves. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Suraji finally confessed, not with horror, but with pride. He spoke of the voices that guided him and his sacred mission. He also revealed that his 3 wives had helped him, one of whom, Tumina, participated in luring victims and concealing evidence. When the final count ended, police had uncovered 42 bodies. Suraji was convicted of 42 murders in 1998 and sentenced to death by firing squad. Even as he awaited execution, he remained eerily calm, telling one interviewer that he felt no guilt because every life I took was part of the ritual. Ahmad Suraji was executed in 2008. His story is a chilling reminder of how belief, when twisted, can justify the unthinkable. In a land where faith runs deep, his crimes left scars that still linger in whispers and folklore. The next killer we must examine was also a child of his environment, but his reign of terror began when he was barely a teenager, turning the streets of his own city into a sudden and brutal hunting ground. It began quietly in the quiet streets of Quito, Ecuador, where a shadow began to crawl through the darkness. His name was Juan Fernando Hermosa, but soon everyone would know him by a far more chilling title, the child killer of Quito. The city discovered the horrifying truth. The monster behind a wave of murders was a teenager, barely 16 years old, who was about to stain Ecuador's history forever. Juan's life began like a silent storm. Born into poverty, he grew up surrounded by neglect and anger, quickly learning that the world was cruel. At school, he was intelligent, even charming, with an almost innocent smile that could disarm anyone. But behind those calm eyes, a dark fascination with death, control, and power was brewing. It began with petty thefts, escalating quickly to robbing strangers at gunpoint. He liked the feeling of fear, the way people froze when he pointed the weapon. But soon, fear alone wasn't enough. One cold night, Juan and a small group of teenage accomplices, boys just like him, decided to go further. They began calling themselves Los Niños del Terror, the Children of Terror. They prowled the streets, hunting for victims at random. Their first known victim was a taxi driver, and Juan pulled the trigger without hesitation, his young face emotionless. That was the moment the child within him died completely. The murders became more frequent and more brutal. Juan moved through his life as if nothing had changed, returning home to eat dinner with his mother and smiling at his neighbors, only to disappear again into the night. But the city had begun to notice. Taxi drivers refused to work after dark, and whispers spread of a child killer who showed no mercy. Juan's confidence grew, and he began boasting to friends, describing his crimes with pride, almost daring the world to stop him. As the bodies piled up, another taxi driver found slumped over his steering wheel, a single bullet through his head. The police were baffled, never imagining the monster they were chasing was still in high school. Juan would flag down a taxi, direct the driver to a deserted area, and then a shot would echo through the empty streets. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dominance and the rush of taking a life. But cracks began to appear in his disguise. When Juan suspected one of his own accomplices had betrayed him, he acted without hesitation. His friend Hugo became his next victim. Killing was no longer an act, it was instinct. One night, while trying to escape a police patrol after a botched robbery, Juan was shot and wounded. By the time police raided his hiding place, they found his gun, blood-stained clothes, and letters confessing everything with cold pride. When he was finally captured, the people of Quito couldn't believe it. The terrifying killer was a boy with the face of a child, and yet behind that face, there was nothing but a void. In prison, he looked too young, but he quickly gained a reputation, thriving on the currency of fear. On a quiet evening in 1996, chaos erupted. Several inmates cornered him in a dark corridor, and the boy who once controlled fear found himself surrounded by it. When guards rushed in, they found him lying motionless, his body riddled with stab wounds. The infamous child killer of Quito was gone, silenced by the same violence he had once unleashed on others. The profound tragedy of Juan Fernando Hermosa, the boy who craved power and died a teenager consumed by it, leaves us with one final partnership in crime, a couple whose absolute, random malice shattered the American Midwest. It started in the summer of 1984, a season that would stain the American Midwest with terror. Two drifters, Alton Coleman and his devoted partner Deborah Brown, embarked on a killing spree so senseless and so brutal that it left entire communities paralyzed with fear. Coleman was not a man people noticed at first glance. His charm was disarming, but beneath that mask hid a predator who could switch from kindness to savagery in an instant. Their crimes began with the promise of companionship. They would befriend strangers, young or old, black or white. What started as trust always ended in terror. Their first known victim was Vernita Wheat, a 9-year-old girl in Wisconsin whose body was found in an abandoned building. From that moment, Coleman's path was drenched in blood. The pair became nomads of death, traveling from state to state across Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Kentucky, leaving behind a trail of bodies, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. The fear grew because Coleman and Brown did not kill for money, they killed for the thrill. They crossed racial, geographic, and moral boundaries with no hesitation, attacking families, raping women, and strangling children. In Ohio, they invaded the home of a loving grandmother and attacked an engaged couple. In another horrifying episode, Coleman forced 2 sisters into a wooded area, killing one and leaving the other barely alive. What made their spree so chilling was its randomness. Coleman was the manipulative force, while Deborah Brown, deeply infatuated and emotionally dependent, followed his every command. Together, they were unstoppable, living off stolen cars and the kindness of strangers. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in the country's history. After months of fear and pursuit, it all came to an end in Evanston, Illinois, when a sharp-eyed citizen recognized the couple from the wanted posters. Police surrounded the area, and for the first time, Coleman's arrogance crumbled. He was arrested without a fight, looking less like a fearless killer and more like a man who knew the end had come. During his interrogation, Coleman showed no remorse, speaking with chilling calmness, recalling the murders as if recounting a trip. His accomplice, Deborah Brown, remained eerily silent, her loyalty to him unbroken. Coleman was sentenced to death in multiple states. Brown received life imprisonment without parole. In 2002, after nearly 2 decades on death row, Alton Coleman was executed by lethal injection in Ohio. Even today, the story of Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown remains one of the darkest and most disturbing tales in American criminal history. A chilling reminder of how 2 ordinary faces can hide the darkest hearts imaginable. Their reign of terror was random and widespread. But our final story must focus on a single killer whose long life of deception began with one shocking murder and was only fully revealed decades later by the cold, hard persistence of science. Part 25. John Arthur Gottschalk, the Stanford Bad Kreuznach Killer. It was 1963 on the American military base in Bad Kreuznach, West Germany, a place where people left their doors unlocked. That sense of safety was shattered when 15-year-old Margaret Williams, the daughter of a U.S. Army sergeant, went missing one night. Her body was found hours later near a wooded area, beaten and strangled. The answer to who could do something so brutal came from within their own community. 17-year-old John Arthur Gottschalk, a tall, charming, and seemingly responsible boy whose father also served in the army. Because of his age, a German court sentenced him to just 10 years. After serving only part of that time, Gottschalk walked free, quietly returned to America, and the world forgot his name. But Gottschalk didn't forget what he had done. He had gotten away with murder, and deep down, he knew he could do it again. In the early 1970s, Gottschalk was living in California, rebuilding his life with terrifying ease. He got married, had children, and volunteered in community events. To anyone who met him, he was the perfect man, polite, intelligent, even gentle. But beneath that polished exterior, something dark was stirring again. It began near Stanford University, where young women began disappearing. In 1973, Leslie Perlov, a 21-year-old law clerk, went missing. 3 days later, her body was discovered in the foothills, strangled with her own scarf. Just a year later, another young woman, Janet Taylor, was found murdered under similar circumstances. The community was terrified, but the cases went cold. Meanwhile, Gottschalk continued his double life. He became a Boy Scout leader and a lab technician, gaining the trust of everyone around him. Even after a sexual assault conviction in 1975, he managed to avoid long-term imprisonment and slipped through the cracks again. No one connected the quiet family man to the Stanford murders. For decades, the case files of Perlov and Taylor gathered dust. But time, as always, has a way of catching up. Fast forward to 2018, more than 40 years after the murders. A revolution in forensic science was rewriting the rules of justice, and investigators used genetic genealogy on old DNA samples from Leslie Perlov's case. The results were immediate and shocking. The DNA pointed to one man, John Arthur Gottschalk. Police quietly watched him. He was now in his late 70s, gray-haired, polite, and living a calm suburban life. Neighbors described him as kind, generous, even grandfatherly. But behind the front door of that quiet house lived a monster who had evaded justice for half a century. When detectives finally confronted him, Gottschalk tried to remain calm, but as they presented the DNA results, his mask began to crack. He was arrested and charged with the murders of Leslie Perlov and Janet Taylor. In 2021, he was found guilty of first-degree murder, and the following year, he pleaded guilty to killing Taylor. In court, the families who had waited almost 50 years faced him. Gottschalk sat motionless, offering no apology, no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After decades of deception, justice had finally found him. John Arthur Gottschalk's story is one of the most chilling examples of how evil can hide in plain sight. He was a murderer at 17, a rapist at 30, and a killer again at 40. For decades, he walked among ordinary people, pretending to be one of them. But in the end, science and persistence tore away the mask he'd worn for half a century. He sits in a California prison cell, a frail old man, and his story stands as a haunting reminder. Some monsters never change, they just grow older. And that is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of all of these stories, that the darkest impulses can endure for a lifetime, hiding behind the kindest of faces, ready to strike when the world least expects it. Good night, and please remember to lock your doors. Outside the window, the rain has stopped. The streets are clean now, washed smooth and quiet. But the silence that follows the rain is often the deepest silence of all, the kind of silence where the things we fear the most go on unnoticed, waiting for the night to fall again. Thank you for listening. All 25 parts are now complete.